Can you hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. I'm really overwhelmed and blown away because I've been just sitting in a couple of these sessions and I've just been really impressed by what I've seen and what I've heard. And can I, for a show of hands, is there anybody in this room who's never felt a fraud? Anybody never felt a fraud? Today or anytime? Because I'm standing up here, I'm feeling a bit of a fraud. But I was having a conversation with Tanya, who Tanya is in the last session, and we were talking about things coming up for us, and I said, well, what's coming up for me is interesting because I took the decision about 2 or 3 years ago to go with whatever emerges, just accept whatever comes up without looking for work or looking for this or looking for that, and just seeing what happens and go with that. And I think that's kind of why I'm here. I also want to say before I begin that I'm kind of a big picture person, and I kind of what I'm looking at here today, or what I want to look at and share with you, is not anything particular and not just stories, but some of the things that are interesting me in my own life, in my own development. I'll say more about that a bit later. But which cover both storytelling, both personal and other stories that we can interact with. And also, and maybe I can put my second slide up here. How can the arts support and help business in its own development? Because I think it's a huge amount that we as creative people and improvisers in particular can offer to the world of business. And kind of that's where my head has been, and what I wrote 2 months ago for the abstract has kind of moved on. There's still parts of it which I want to touch on, and parts I just want to float because I'm in the process of discovery as well. Some of the key themes I want to cover are these. And if they're not entirely clear right now, I hope they'll become clear as we go through this process. I've got my little structure down here which I'm going to need to look at from time to time. I have to say, I've never done this particular presentation before. I'll probably never ever do it again. So it's kind of one-off, although it's recorded for posterity apparently. That was a shock for me about 5 minutes ago.
You said yes.
I said, okay, let's see what happens. Maybe I should say a little bit about why I'm here and who I am. Well, who I am is a bit of a stretch. I've just come from a 2-week Zen retreat in Salt Lake City. So who am I is and it was interesting. I came in yesterday off the airplane feeling very sort of zen and grounded, and the energy in this room was completely different. That was it. But that's interesting to play with. So let me tell you a little bit about my story so far, to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. After I left uni, I worked for a year as a teacher in what we call a secondary school in the UK. That's 11 to 18. And I got on great with the kids. I found the teachers kind of difficult. And then I left. I worked in professional theatre for 10 years, in mainstream theatre, TV, radio. I did a lot of improvisational work. And then after 10 years, I was kind of wanting to move on because I got fed up waiting for other people to make decisions. And I started using a lot of improvisation and theatre of the oppressed work in Africa, in South America, and Southeast Asia, which was fabulous while the funding was there. And then Margaret Thatcher got into power, influenced by someone called Ronald. And they had this trickle-down theory idea, which gave money to the rich and it will trickle down, and funding completely dried up. But then I worked in teaching English for foreign language, mostly doing teacher development work, which meant I got back into the same country, so I could continue working with those connections. I worked in educational development work for some time, and then just by chance, about 15 years ago, I met some people who were setting up a learning and development company to work in organizations, and I joined them, and that grew into a different partnership, and in the last 5 years I've had my own company once again. And so, in a sense, I have to confess I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. So taking it on that level, I'm interested in touching into different areas and seeing what comes up. As Belina said, I've also worked a lot with stories, and I've written a number of books of stories. So I'd like to start with a story. And you might have seen that puzzle that was up here earlier on. Can you all see this, by the way? Okay. I'll try and keep moving around sometimes so people... There was a traveller who started her journey early in the morning before sunrise, and she'd been travelling through the desert all morning, and it was about 20 past 11, and she was hot and tired and thirsty, and she came to an oasis. And it was one of those oases where there are huts, habitations. And she slipped off her camel at the first hut and knocked on the door. And a young man answered, and she said to him, "I beg you, young man, in the name of Allah, the Merciful, for the great gift of water." And the young man turned, went up, came back with a clay pitcher full of clean water, and gave it to her. And she took it. But before drinking, thirsty as she was, she said, "I thank you for the three great gifts of life: the gift of water, the gift of generosity, and the gift of life itself." And then she drained the whole pitcher in one swift draught and gave the young man the pitcher back. And she said, "You've given me the three great gifts. Now what can I do for you?" And he said, "Well, I don't know if you can help me because, well, it's difficult. You see, my father passed away some 3 or 4 weeks ago, and in his will, which we adhere to very closely in our culture, he left to me and my 2 older brothers his herd of camels. And that's our difficulty. For the last few weeks, we've been fighting and struggling and at each other's throats because we have 17 camels in the herd. That's a pretty good phone you've got. That's a pretty... The problem is we've only got 17 camels, and he left very clear instructions about how we should divide the camels. You see, he said, my elder brother should get 1/2 of the herd, second brother should get 1/3, and youngest brother, that's me, should get 1/9. Now, we're finding it very hard to do that. And we don't want to kill any camels because they're worth much more alive than they are dead. And that's where our current problems arise from. So the traveller thought to herself for a moment, oh, and by the way, I forgot to ask you, just put a frame around this as you're listening to it, because stories, as you know, can be many different things. I'd just like you to listen to and think about this story in the context of leadership, in the broadest sense of the word. Just think about it as leadership. So the traveller stepped back for a moment and thought, and then she said, young man, you've given me 3 great gifts. Now let me give you what is most precious to me. I give you my camel. Now do your mathematics. So the young man said, okay, so I've got 18 camels now, and that's half for eldest brother, that's 9. Third for second brother, 6. 50. And 9th for me, that's 2. But that's only 17 camels. Yes, said the traveller, and as it happens, the one remaining is the one that I gave you. So if you wouldn't mind, perhaps you'd like to give me it so I can be on my way. So just turn to 2 or 3 people around you. Just take 90 seconds or 2 minutes. What does that story say to you about what leadership could be? What are the gifts of leadership? Generosity. What else?
Don't be attached to a particular outcome.
Okay, don't be attached to particular outcomes. Great.
Saving face.
Saving face. Say a bit more about that.
The extra camel was, she didn't need the extra camel, she figured it out, but she didn't embarrass him. And so she allowed him to feel like he had something to give and that he was okay.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah.
To lead, sometimes you give something and you get it back.
Absolutely. Whatever we give, we get back in most aspects of life. It's important. Yeah.
That giving itself to inspire creativity, collaborative creativity, and solutions that you would have thought of.
That's right.
Leadership can be a vessel for people to realize their own potential, meaning that I'm just focusing you to do what you need to do.
I think there's some gratitude in that the leader initially accepted a gift and was appreciative of that, and at that point then was able to give back.
So gratitude repaid by gratitude. An ongoing circle. Thank you. Yeah, cool.
Is it that the leader should be an accountant?
That maybe one small part of the expertise. Yeah, I was shy about it. Yeah.
I saw shape-shifting, where there was this moment of, look at the problem.
Sorry.
Thank you very much! You haven't heard, that's called the failure bow, or the circus bow, and there. The problem was we had no audio for the whole first, there was like 20 people watching live, they're like, no audio, no audio. So, my apologies, now we're good.
No problem. Yeah, sorry.
Shape-shifting the problem. There was a moment there of, and they like seeing it differently.
Expanding the pie and not seeing things as fixed when they can be fluid.
Two more. One, two.
It started out from thirst, started out from longing, and then that taking the gratitude even a step further. It started out from being grateful for the smallest things, you know.
Well, as an educator, it's imparting knowledge and then being able to still lead with the tools that you came in with.
Yeah, it just blows me. I'm going to move on because, as we say, that what blows me away is the knowledge that we have in the group. There's so much that we know about leadership, and so much that actually leaders know about leadership, but often don't manifest. So I think for me, two particular things that come up are, one, the ability to be present.
Very well.
To be present to what's going on. I do exactly And secondly, as somebody said, to be able to give away what one considers one's most precious resource for the greater good. And isn't that just what improvisation is? It seems to me, and this is something I want to explore, that leadership, in its broadest sense, and what improvisation offers, are in many ways one and the same thing. And you know, to be in an improvisation situation, and I guess we've all known this, the ego wants to present one great idea as something not for me, and yet what the present moment is calling for is something much, much more than that. It would, Keith Johnson says, be obvious. That's what's calling us. It's that present awareness. So that brings me to a sense of asking ourselves, and particularly when we think about the world of business, how we can move from the world of scarcity to the world of abundance. Now, I think in many ways, in material terms, we have got to manage scarcity because that's the world we currently live in. But in some of the things, and this came up in some of the responses I got when I asked about what the story said for you, in things like generosity, in love, in energy, in wisdom, the more we give out, the more we tend to get back. You know, and a nice metaphor for that is the Dead Sea between Jordan and Israel. I mean, that sea is dying very rapidly. And the reason is it has a river flowing into it, but it has no outlet. And I think that's a great metaphor to think about a lot of the world of business and a lot of people as well. If there's no outlet for the energy, the gratitude that's flowing in, it's going to die. Well, we're all going to die. But how do we create a sense of flow, a sense of energy that empowers us all? And in the same sense that we're all driven by fear. I mean, I think all of us are driven by fear, although many of us are quite in denial of that. Business, I think, is particularly driven by fear. And one of the things I think is fascinating about people like you, as creative artists and improvisers, is to be an improviser, you have to be fearless. That's not to deny fear. It's not to deny fear, it's to face your fear. And so that's another gift I think we can all bring into the world of business and leadership in particular. And I called this presentation Touching the Heart, and I think perhaps the key word here is courage. Or for those of you who are French speakers, courage. That didn't come out quite the way I meant it to. What I wanted to touch on was actually courage is the clue that the word comes from the heart, could. Courage is a heart thing, it's not a head thing. Businesses tend to be stuck in their heads. Courage comes from the heart. It's not even a belly thing. Fear comes from the belly. And we need that courage from the heart to overcome the constriction of the belly and the blockage in the head. So, how do we touch the heart? Well, we touch the heart perhaps through compassion. Compassion first of all to ourselves. Compassion to others. Compassion for the planet. We also overcome and we get courage through connection to ourselves, to our values, connection to our work. And another key theme here is how many people do we meet who are disconnected from their work? You know, most of us are going to spend 40 years or so of our lives in the world of work. And so many people see it as something that is separate from themselves, something they go to, they work from 9 to 5, or very often 7 till 10, in a lot of the big corporates. And it's just a way of surviving. And one of the great gifts that all you people have, and I'm lucky to have too, is that I love what I do, and I guess you do too. And that's reward enough in itself in many ways, is that right? And it's something we have, which is a great gift, which many people don't have. And just coming up for me now is the poet David White. And David White, I mean, his books, which just goes down in my head, Crossing the Unknown Sea, and what about heart?
The heart around.
The heart around. Those of you who haven't read, I really recommend reading those in terms of touching the passion between work and oneself as a creative journey. Because as he said, you know, it's very hard to tell your father-in-law that he decided to become a professional full-time poet. And yet he's made a great career of it. One of the things that happens in the world of business is that learning and development programs often tend to be about competence, accountancy, skills. And these things are important, but my question is, are they enough? Is it enough to be focused on tasks? Because what I think most leadership calls out for is relationship, and that's what most of you are working on really well. So I'd just like to share another little story. This story is from about 3,000 years old, and it's a story about a little town in China where every year there would be a magnificent archery competition. And archers would come from all over the known world to present their skills. And this particular year, there was a young archer. He was very young, but he was very, very good. He was so good that with his first arrow, he could hit the center of the target. His second arrow split the first arrow, and his third arrow split the second. And he won the prize. And he stood on the stage having won the prize. And you know, it was sad. He was quite young, and all this came to him very early. And he was rather brash and rather arrogant. And he looked around the assembled throng, and he saw a monk, an old monk, who in the past had been a really very skillful archer. And he looked at the monk and said, "Beat that." And the monk just smiled and just beckoned the young man. And the young man was curious. The monk turned around, walked through the crowd and through the narrow alleyways of the town, up through the meadows, up through the woods, and into the high pasture, up and up into the mountains, and where finally they came to a place where there was a deep fissure in the ground. And both men standing on the edge of this fissure could hear the water tumbling across rocks far below. And between the two edges, two sides of the chasm, was a log. An old, decaying, moss-covered, gentle in the wind. The archer stepped lightly onto the log, took an arrow from his quiver, threaded his bow, selected a distant boundary marker, and straight to the center of the target. And the monk stepped off the log and said to the young man, "Beat that." And the young man looked at the log, swaying in the wind, saw its treacherous surface, heard the sound of water on the rocks far below, and didn't even have courage to step onto the log, let alone to fire his bow. The old monk said, "Young man, you have great skill with your bow, very little skill with the mind that lets the arrow You know, that would be. But my suspicion is, and you storytellers in here will know exactly, that's probably the guy who taught me that story, phoning up and saying, "Give me some credit." We've done that much then. Now, if I was to ask you which of those two you'd rather be led by, I think it's probably quite a no-brainer. And I wanted that sort of to be an illustration of the fact that working on tasks and skills and competences by itself is not enough to be a leader in any sense of the word. And I want to share with you a model which I think has certainly helped me to understand that, and I'd like to share it with you. Some of you may know it. How many of you are familiar with Ken Wilber? Okay, quite a lot of you. That's great. For those who don't, I mean, Ken is probably the most widely read philosopher, living philosopher in the world today. And I think his contribution has been massive. This is a model based on his Earth theory of everything. The Earth is important. And basically what he's done is he's divided the whole world into 4 quadrants, the typical consultant model. But we've got the outer world on the right-hand side. In other words, what starts outside our skin, and on the left-hand side we've got the inner world, what's inside of ourselves. And above the line we've got self, below the line we've got other. So in the upper right quadrant, these are the skills of the young archer. They're the professional skills of competency, behavior, all the things that are important to get things done in the world of business or education or any aspect of our lives. Upper left, we've got the personal. This is the world of personal consciousness. Constantly deepening and developing personal awareness or awakeness. And I want to say a little bit more about that later on. Lower left, we've got the cultural area, which is about shared vision, shared language, where you and I meet and create a we. And in the lower right, we've got what I call infrastructure, which is the material conditions in which we operate. So right now we've got a kind of electrical framework with chairs in a row, and we've got some technology here. You know, this is what is. This is what is difficult to change straight away. We can move it around. Earlier on it was in a different format. The infrastructure is what we work in. Let me say a bit more about that. Let's see if I can make it clearer. For example, in an organization or in an office, the infrastructure might be you're still working with Windows 95. Or you might have this second word that you think is. I haven't got it yet, so I don't know. You may have an open plan office, or it might be everyone working in small cubicles. But these are the things. Now, one of the things I wanted to say about that story with the archer is that the archer, whereas the young archer operates only in the profession, I would say the old monk operates both here. He's skillful with his bow and arrow, but he also has a lot of personal awareness and mindfulness. And he's also operating here. I mean, I think the slippery log is a great metaphor for the world of business or education. Every day it's different. It's a slippery log. It's changing all the time. And we have to work on these things. I don't think there's anything here, but if you go back to the story of the camels, I think the wise traveler was working across all those 4 quadrants. And the importance of this integral view, this integrated way of connecting with all these 4 quadrants, I think is really essential if we're going to move into any sustainable work. Because if we leave any one of those quadrants out, we're missing something key and critical. If I was to ask you which quadrants does business most operate in, where would you say? Which? Professional and instructional. Most business, not all, but most, works on the right-hand side. Why?
People are afraid.
People are afraid.
Control is always.
Yeah, it's measurable. It's measurable. How do you measure culture? How do you measure personal development? And yet, without the left-hand side, you don't have an organization. The word organization comes from the word organism, which is dynamic, it's living, it's changing. One of the problems with most organizations is they've closed things down, and the freedom to grow and develop is not there because there's too much structure. Does that make sense? And again, that is something else, another key area where improvisation has so much to offer. So how might one develop the abilities to move around here? Well, I think, for me, I think the key thing is to start with oneself. The great Zen master, Owen, 800 years ago said, if you want to know the Buddha, first you must study yourself. He could have come from a different tradition. He could have said, if you want to know Yahweh, if you want to know God, if you want to know the truth, first you must study yourself. And one of the things that's interesting, and certainly Genpo Roshi, the Zen master I've been working with the last 2 weeks, was making clear, and it was very interesting for me to hear this. What he's saying is that the pathway of spirituality, all spirituality, it's all the same path, with different ways of getting there to the same path. But the field of spirituality and the field of psychology are one and the same. We can only start by beginning to understand and study ourselves and move towards where we want to get to and understand the situation within it. So let's start with a little bit of lightheartedness here. And I'd like to take you through a little writing activity about yourself, which I'd like to share with other people. And some of you may know this is called a bio poem, and it's a version of it. I'd like you, have you got some pen and paper? Some pen and paper? No? You have to start borrowing or begging. I don't need it. She does. You got some? Anybody need some? Thank you very much.
Ed wants to be generous right now.
Okay. So, the first line of your poem is write down your name. Do not write down Nick Owen, that's me. Just write down your name. Done? The second line from your first name, 3 adjectives which alliterate with your first name.
Can you explain them?
Yeah, the same sound, like it says there. Nice, naughty, knowledgeable. Your name's Bill, big, brash, bold.
And for Z's.
What?
That's for Z's.
Aziz?
No. For the letter Z.
Z?
Z's.
Oh, Z. How interesting. Yeah. Good.
So, Jamie.
All right. The third line starts with the words, who has loved. Complete that line. Who has loved? Someone's doing that next poem. Fourth line starts with 2 words, who wanted.
What?
Who wanted. Here's going down low. And the last line is the same as the first line, your name. Now just take a minute to edit it if you wish, and then maybe share it with 2 or 3 people around you, maybe different people you shared it before, and listen to what theirs is as well. So just have a listen into what each of you have written.
See, I guess to read it, think about it as a poem.
Yeah, read it as a poem to each other. those of you who write will know what it's like to look at a blank page.
Yes.
And just to have some structure like this can actually release so much. And one of the things that amused me when Berlina was chasing me for the abstract for this talk 2 or 3 months ago was, we want to know what your structure is. It's an improvisation conference. I don't know what I don't know what I'm going to be talking about here. Yet the fact is, of course, we can't make any sense or meaning without some structure. And Keith Johnson, who I knew when he was, I didn't really know him, but knew about his work when he was barely out of short trousers, and so was I. Structure is off the block of sound. The structure is reincorporation. The structure has got to be there. Jazz, there has to be that, those 8 notes you improvise on, which make meaning. And it seems to me that all life operates within the 2 polarities of structure and chaos, and this is what holds us. Without structure and chaos, there would just be amorphousness. And within the structure and the chaos, there's a tension. It's not a balance. Balance is stasis. There's a tension which is like a dance. It's always moving. Sometimes more towards the chaos, sometimes more towards the structure. But both are essential to hold what is in between. And what is in between is the field of form, action, and innovation. Now, I think this is a model that makes absolute sense to all of us working in improvisation and creative art. It doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people working in organizations and in education, administration. One of the key issues for most businesses is once they have a successful product, they want to hang on to it without any sense that the world is changing. The world is uncertain, like the slippery line. And one of the issues that may be there for us as creative artists is sometimes we go so far to the side of innovation that we lose sight of the structure. So where do we need to be? Again, it comes back to being in the present moment and aware of what's happening around us so we can deal with what emerges. If there's too much structure, we get stuck. We get ossified. At the same time, if there's too much chaos, we move into disintegration. We can't cope with a new idea every day in a business context. I mean, we can in theatre, it's slightly different. So that exploration of the tension between the two, there's a nice analogy of when you were kids, I guess there was a playground around you nearby, and was it one of those monkey things, that you had? So you're hanging with your left arm on your monkey rungs. You're all familiar with the monkey rungs? Bars. Monkey bars. So, God, this is back. Yes. You're swinging with your left arm. So what have you got to do to move?
Right.
You've got to, well, if you let go like that, you've got to just drop. But you've got to swing, and as you swing with the right side, you're going to have to let go. That's the hardest thing to do, because it's a leap of faith to the next one. But the next part is also where you get stuck. So every time, all of us in our lives get stuck from time to time, and then we need to learn to let go and have a leap of faith to the next stage. So, let me see. Yeah, so we're all working in the field of uncertainty, whether it's business or whether it's improvisation. It's all uncertainty. And yet within that uncertainty, what is it that gives us solid ground? Because it's a solid ground we work on that gives us the confidence to proceed, to move ahead. So, have you ever been given a presentation where you've suddenly done one page in front of the other page? And you suddenly think, well, how am I going to reconnect that? Well, that's not. So the question is, what is it that might give us the confidence to find solid ground that will enable us to proceed in a world of chaos to get the results that we want. And it seems to me, well, what I want to talk about for the rest of this session is there are two things. One is our values. How can we connect more to our own personal values, which are actually the basis of our own moral compass? So how can we be true to ourselves? And those values that I have may not be the values you have, and that's fine. But unless I walk my talk, how can I show up authentically in the world? And the second thing is, what are some of the maps and models that are available to us that help us to understand what the human condition is, or what human process is, or what human experience is? And I've already shared a couple of those models. One is this structure and chaos model, and the other was the Wilbur four-quadrant model. So I'd like to share maybe one more model, because this one I've only been aware of in the last 2 or 3 months. And some of you, I'm sure, will know about it. It's Otto Scharmer's U-theory model. Who are you familiar with Otto Scharmer's work? Good. So for those of you who know it, this is my take on it. For those of you who don't, I hope it'll be useful, because I think this is a great way of seeing how we as creative artists can really make a contribution to business, because most people in business do not get this model. That's the U. And we're going to go down the left-hand side, around the bottom, and then up the right-hand side of the U. So the first, this will be very familiar to you. The first element is intention. What is life calling you to do? Now that might be a big macro thing in your life, or it might be something small, like a project, or like a piece of theatre. But not so small. So what is life calling me to do? And if I look around, are there other people whom life is calling for the same thing that I could work with? So co-intentionality is available. So having decided that, sensing, the ability to just be quiet, look around, observe, listen, really listen. And notice all the available information that is there for me inside myself, things I already know, and what I can observe in others, and in books, or in all the resources around me. And take time to do that, and this I'm sure is familiar with all of you in the creative process. Take time to notice what I know. And then, go into a state of presence. Connect to your own inner source in a quiet place, and let go of all the old stuff that's no longer necessary, to let come, to let emerge your awareness in the present moment. Make sense so far? It's very familiar to most artists. And having let things emerge, then start to test them in rehearsal, prototyping, Sharma calls it. Little experiments. Let me try this, let me try that. Let me see what your experiment is. Let me see what... Architects know this very well. For example, good architects, when they create a public park, they don't put the pathways in. They wait for people to walk in the park and see where they walk, and then put the pathways in. Now that's much smarter than what most people do, which is to put the pathways in straight away. It's what business does. Business is also about performance. But business is the only arena of performance I know where they don't know what rehearsal means. Does that make sense? They get an idea and they want to try it straight away. It doesn't work because they haven't thought about it enough. And they wonder why it fails, and they say there's no use. It could be a great idea, but they haven't taken time to go through this process and then start to prototype. And when we start to find the prototypes that merge together and then really work well, that's the rehearsal process. Then we put it into action, and it's evolving. It's evolving, and it will continue to evolve, but it's now embodied in new and sustainable ecosystems. Take ecosystems, meaning whatever you want it to be. And the beauty of this is it's an incredibly intuitive model. This is about intuition. There's some rationality in here, but it's incredibly intuitive. And I think this is where business gets most stuck. It has a huge over-reliance on the rational. Does that make sense in your experience?
God is with you.
Excuse me. It's Jack Welch's private plane. Yeah, business has a blind spot, and that is it's unwilling to step up. Is that great Zen koan? How do you step off a 100-foot flagpole? You just got to step into it. It's uncertain. The world is uncertain. We don't know until we make that move. And business is stuck in the rationality. Sharma puts forward the idea that there are 4 types of listening. The first is what we find so much in the world of business and elsewhere too. I don't want to just, I think business has a great contribution. It does some amazing things. But the first type of listening, which Sharma calls downloading, is I already know that. We find it all the time. I already know that. You have nothing to teach me. And that's about closed mind. The second type of listening you find in business and elsewhere is a scientific inquiry. How interesting. I don't know that. That's different from what I think. Let me explore that. So that's open mind. So that's a step forward. But here we're still talking about what is objective, what is rational, what is it. And business can be very good at that. But the third type of listening is what Sharma calls conversational inquiry, which is about empathy, which is about moving into the you space, which is about, let me really now listen to what it is you have to say, so I can listen with open mind and open heart. Actually, there was a huge amount of discussion about this in the playback session I was at before this session. So this is stuff you already know really well. The fourth type of listening is generative listening, which is what I call I plus. And it's about stepping into the I and then resonating with the whole field around me. And Sharma, and I'll give you a reference for something on the internet later on to read about more about Sharma if you're interested. He gives a lovely story, it's a metaphor, about the classical violinist Mihar Rogachnik, who was invited to play in Chartres Cathedral. And this great violinist, in rehearsal, played his violin, and it sounded so pathetic. He said, I couldn't understand how small my instrument sounded, until he realized that he couldn't play his violin in the way he played it in a concert hall. Chartres Cathedral is massive. He had to play not the violin, he had to learn to play the cathedral. Makes sense? And that's, I think, what we all have to do, to step up to play the whole field. And the whole point about this third and fourth type of listening, the inquiry, conversational inquiry and the generative listening, is how can I end my conversation with others as a different person to how I started? And how can I pursue the highest future possibility in what we're working on? By the way, I noticed a lot of you are writing things down, and I'm going to give my pen drive to Belina or somebody, and she'll put it on the site so you can download it for the slides. Yeah. So I think the key message of this is, how do we enter our life generally? I mean, if we want to be leaders in every sense, we don't want to be leaders all the time. But we need to show up, and we want people to be willing to follow us. And we're moving in and out of leadership roles every moment of our lives. But open heart, open mind, open will. You know, it's not rocket science. It's what athletes call being in the zone. It's what artists call being in the flow. We all know those moments of being so at one with what's around us that it's effortless. Although the effortless often comes after quite a lot of hard work and preparation. The model also fits back, I think, with the one I showed you earlier, the Wilbur model. So we want to connect with the it of the scientific world, the tasky reality that business is so adept at, but also bring in the I and the we, the you plus I for we, and bring those together, and we can make a lot of difference. So we've got just some models. I want to look at some values. One of the problems, I think, with values is that we hold them most of the time unconsciously. Values are not logical, they're emotional. So values connect us to our heart. And they're essential for bringing the heart into what we do and who we are. We often notice what our true values are only when they're violated, when someone offends them. Make sense? And for me, there are two kinds of values. There are navigating values and core values. Core values are values we take from childhood all the way through to our grade and education. Navigating values are the values we hold at the current moment, which may change. Because as we go through our life, we go through periods of utter change and transformation, when we suddenly realize that the coping strategies I had yesterday that worked so well no longer work today. Somehow the world has changed out there, and I need to change with it. Now, I'm going to show you one last model about navigating strategy, which I know Belina found very useful when I went through it. When I went through it in June. Some of you. So many of us continue becoming more complex step by step as we go through our lives. And what I want to share with you is a model that explains that. Some of you will know this. What I'm going to share. There's quite a few different models on stage development or developmental psychology. The one I'm going to share with you is from spiral dynamics. Who's familiar with spiral dynamics? Okay, quite a few. Other ones I work with are William Talbot, Hart Hill Leadership Development Framework, which is very good for working in businesses. It's called research. Keegan's model is another good one. There's a few others. I find it very helpful for understanding that people are not all in the same place. We do not live in a flat land. People are changing all the time, and wherever they happen to be on the spiral of development is perfect for them right here, right now. It's not about better or worse, right or wrong. It's just how people are and where they are. And it's not measuring intelligence, it's measuring the ability to see things in increasingly complex ways and adapting the values that were appropriate to that. So I just want to do a quick thumbnail sketch of that. I don't want to go into too much depth about it because there's lots of depth. But if you're interested, I'll give you some ways in which you can find out more, should you be so interested. Okay, so we can divide stage development up to three key areas. There is the pre-conventional, which basically means immature, like adults behaving like teenagers. So those of you working in education, you can adapt this, you can see this in childhood as well. But this is essentially an adult model of adult development. So the pre-conventional are stages where adults are behaving in rather immature ways by conventional standards. We're going to measure that. Then there's a conventional area where most people, by definition, are centered. And then the post-conventional, where people have moved beyond conventional thinking to start to see things in more and more complex and systemic and interconnected ways. So there are 8 stages. The first one's there, beige. Beige is purely a survival code. And it's very unlikely you're going to see people in your sessions, presentations, seminars, whatever you're running, shows in this state. In the modern world, people in beige will probably be in an accident and emergency unit or in some kind of institution. You will see this when, for example, a tsunami sweeps through a community and destroys everything, and the people who you see on the TV screens have lost everything. You just see them in a state of shock. They're totally dependent on support from others to help them survive the next 24 hours. Their frame of reference is very, very small. Can I survive the next 12, 24 hours? So you're not going to see much of that, but it's inside walls. You know, you're walking 3 o'clock in the morning down a dark alley, having come out of a nightclub where you shouldn't be. And you suddenly hear footsteps behind you, and the hairs in the back of your neck. The hackles rise. That's your base. That's your survival instinct operating. It's in us all, but it's often deeply submerged. The next stage of development is purple. It's a tribal code. So you can match this over. You can see this in cultures over the last 50,000 years. So the beige would be the nomads, the groups of 10 or 12 people in the savannah, looking after themselves, 4 Fs, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and fornicating. And then they realize that it's hard to survive as a small group, so they make tribes for safety. So the tribal, in the modern context, you find it in, for example, in African tribes, but you also find it in gangs, in fans of teams, sports teams. You'll find purple tribal instincts in the boardroom in large companies. Groups that connect together. We know who we are because we know who we're not. Yeah. And often very superstitious, ritualistic, magical solutions. And when that becomes inefficient, then what happens is a strong leader emerges. And the strong leader, coded red, is about power. How can I get what I want in a world where there's not enough to go around? So people centered in red, I mean teenagers, for example, in this period because they're disidentifying themselves from authority figures. But we see it in the adult world as well. How can I get what I need to get in a world where there are not enough resources? I want it, and I want it now. It's very much about me. Me. People in the red code won't take any feedback. They will always blame outside themselves. If you give them managerial power, they're not particularly good at it because they have no sense of social interactions with others. What can I get from others rather than what can I give to others? It's highly creative. It's very heroic. The theme song might be, I did it my way. All these stages have a healthy and an unhealthy manifestation. The healthy red is fabulous, it's energizing, it's creative, it's self-confident, often ridiculously so. But it's about breaking rules. It's about challenging authority. And if you harness that, it's fabulous. If you enter a conflict with red, then it becomes very tricky. The next stage is blue, which is about obedience. And in terms of human development over time, this was when the red leadership, tyrannical, exploitative leadership, created anarchy and chaos, and a new movement emerged to create structure and stability of the world. So you get a sense of the development of organized religion, the idea that you would have to suffer now to have paradise later. With the blue code came pensions. Suffer now, save now, so that your future will be secure. Remember those days when pensions were But in the blue code, what happens is people look outside of themselves for something to give them a sense of order and authority and structure. It could be God, or it could be the law, or it could be divine kingship. But essentially, there's something that gives a sense of order and structure and hierarchy. I know my place and I feel safe there. And as I'm going through these, you're probably listening and thinking, well, I wonder where I show up here. No, you show up all these places. But where's your current center? And what about people around you that you know and love, people you work with? And how might I connect with these people? Because the values of each of these stages are different. So when we're working with them, we have to work in a multi-connected way. In terms of organizations, blue is very much the old control and command structures. Very clear who's the CEO, who's the board, who's the directors, who reports to who. Which is finding it difficult to work these days. So the next stage is orange, which is achievement code, entrepreneurial code. This is very much based on rationality and logic and thinking, how can I get, for me and those important to me, as much as I can, using my knowledge and power and skill and resources to get what I want now. Whereas blue is looking at the future, orange is looking at now. And the orange code has given us all the great things like this amazing computer and your mobile phones and your dishwashers and all the things that make life so much easier than it was for our parents. But with all these codes, there's always a seed of its own destruction. So for the orange code, I've got what I want. I'm materially successful. I've got my Porsche in the garage. I've got the biggest house on the street. I've got a big fat pension. The kids are all at university. But what the hell is life all about? Who am I? I'm not happy. The material things don't give me enough. So you move into the green code, the next code, which is about inclusion. In a sense that there is really important to recognize that everybody on the planet, all human beings have a contribution and should be of value. Everyone has a place. Everyone should be listened to. And in the last 150 years since this code has emerged, there's been a tremendous awakening of understanding and openness and inclusion around the planet. I think made a great contribution. One of the problems with the green paradox here for the green system is the sense that because everyone has to be listened to, whether they have anything to say or not, nothing gets done. So you move into another code, the yellow complexity code, which starts to integrate a sense of how can we be competent and manage things in order to make things happen in a world where there is not enough to go around, and how can we bring things together to understand the amazing interconnectedness of things. So whereas green was looking at all human beings, the yellow system is looking at all living things and interconnected as a living entity. And so it's a much better systemic way of looking at things, and it's increasingly concerned with sustainability. And then we finally get, well not finally because there'll be more systems to come, but the turquoise code, and very few people, I mean we've gone up here, fewer and fewer people show up at these stages of development, although everyone will have had a glimpse of them. But the turquoise is looking at creating a unity, bringing together thought on the one hand, rationality and feeling. Thought and intuition, rationality and intuition, and bringing that together to understand that we have to work in an integrated, systemic way if we're going to create the possibility of sustainability on the planet. And more, I think, I'm beginning to recognize that that kind of interconnection is going to be increasingly important. Now, does that give you a little idea of, some say no. Okay, what's the no?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. No. Yeah. So, sense, yes.
I'm struggling a little bit with it because I think there's a masculine and feminine aspect of this that where women have fit in and men fit in. I see the balance. I see women at some higher level, obviously. But I mean, I really think that in terms of women in business, I guess is what I'm thinking about, is that as we're moving up to those higher levels, we're seeing more women entering those levels of position because those are more validated.
Can you all hear that at the back?
No.
Do you want to say it a bit louder?
I'm looking at this in terms of the feminine and masculine aspects of people, and the fact that I see some of these traits as more feminine. Certain more women are at the higher, at the more conventional or post-conventional. That's what we've operated on in terms of where we've evolved from. Am I being wrong? Or
Yeah. This is a minefield to go into. You could do, although we all carry a left and right brain. We all have both hemispheres. We all have the masculine and the feminine archetypes within us, although we may have them in different proportions. What I would say this is that we often talk about this side, the warm colors as the I code. In other words, this is about me. And here, and these ones here, we say, my center of attention is in myself, and my question is, how can I use my own power to change the world out there? Whereas on this side, the cool colors, the we codes, is my attention is out there on the community in which I operate. How can I change myself to conform with that community? Now, the theory of this is that we move from one code to another. We can't jump codes. We need to go through them sequentially, although there's some debate going on about that. But generally speaking, each level gives us the codes we need to get to the next stage of development. Now, the more we can connect with those codes at that stage, the more likely we are as we move forward to have that well embedded. What often happens, I'll just give you a taste of this because I want to move on and do something on story. For example, we have a lot of people working in the green value system, for example, in education and let's say in community services like health and social services. And these people who have this sense of inclusion have to work a lot with people who are centered in the red code. And one of the issues is that there's often a kind of false idea that working, let's say, with disadvantaged kids, that they can somehow, through love and compassion, jump from level 3 to level 6. And they can't do it. It's too big a leap. So the question then is, I mean, this is important for educators because so many teenagers are here, and the question is, how do we get, and I think it's a big shift in education that has to be made, how can we help teenagers go from this code here into a sense of stability and structure from which they can work in a self-disciplined way on their own personal development? To actually not go out and play football, because that's what I want to do right now, but to actually learn something which takes time. And I think a good example is this. I didn't get my blue, my structure in life from school or from my parents. I got my blue from two things. One, theatre in school. The whole idea of rehearsal, going through the discipline of rehearsal to get to a finished performance is a blue learning process. Does that make sense? Yeah. I have to say, I can't get it right away. How can I go? And learning to play musicians, the same thing. That's another great thing for kids to do, to go from the red to the blue, to learn a discipline and to defer, defer gratification into the future, thank you. And the other thing I got it from was sport. I mean, I was a rower. And, you know, I learned that you have to go through the pain of training to get to where you want to be, to get to a certain level, to feel the, I mean, for me, it wasn't winning. I mean, I enjoyed winning the races, but it was just the sheer beauty of sitting in a boat with 7 other guys and moving gracefully through water, shifting great puddles. But, you know, one of the things that being in the UK anyway, it's being attacked now, is that parents coming out of this orange code, the achievement code, they say, we don't want our children to study the arts, theatre and music and dance. That's for wussies. That's not going to help my sons or daughters get high quality grades in the important subjects like mathematics and sciences and engineering and so on. We don't want that sort of stuff. And parents coming out of the green code are saying, well, we don't want sport. We don't want competition. We want cooperation, harmony, and love. So what happens, the administrators hear both, and then sport goes, and the arts go. So we get more and more this thing about measuring learning in terms of subjects which are highly rational and not intuitive. Now, there's nothing wrong with being rational, but we need to put both of those together.
Damping's holding mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So just to apply this model to where we are as a community, from my perspective, even though it's an individual developmental model, I think that organizations and communities often as an aggregate group take on one of these developmental codes. And I think for us as a community of applied improv, I think we're pretty green. And maybe some orange in there, not quite at yellow. And it's not until you get to yellow where you appreciate the levels that came before. We're working with a lot of organizations that are orange and blue. And we have to meet them where they're at and realize they're not green, many of them yet. And we're not yellow yet, so we're not appreciating them.
Did you all hear that?
Yeah.
That is so important because this is a model that can be worked. You can work on this with individuals or in small groups, large groups, cultures, nations, communities. And the point you're making that we ourselves have to recognize which of the systems, which of the stages we're coming from, and ask ourselves, how do we need to translate what we're doing to connect with people at different stages of development? And I think that's the key issue I'd like you to get from this. Yeah.
The other piece for me that you spoke to already is that at no point, no matter how blue or turquoise, you can still have beige triggered by some life circumstance. And so that's where compassion comes in for self and other. And that, to me, is such a key piece in all this work that we're doing, because otherwise it's very easy to get a bit, to not have humility and humbleness in the work that we're doing in ourselves.
And as you see, one of the things about values is we all tend to believe, now, tell me is this true, we all tend to believe that our values are the right ones and correct ones.
Yeah. Oh, no, not me.
No, not me. That's not my shadow. So again, it's that compassion to recognize that wherever we're coming from is what's right and true for them at this current moment, and tomorrow it may be different. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think what's very different around Skyrim for a couple times now is the importance of looking at these models as this imagery is just a model, and that it's extremely complex, and that at any moment, any individual can be at any point along that spiral, and even an organization is composed of many individuals who also can be on any point of that spiral at any point in time. So this kind of looks like a simple model, but it's more moving towards complexity, and back into uncertainty, and
You're absolutely right. It's absolutely about certainty and uncertainty and complexity, and recognizing that there's an absolute need for us to be open and aware of where people are coming from at any one time, both as individuals or in different divisions in an organization or teams in a division. Where are they coming from? What do they need? And working at multiple levels of interconnection. Because a team of people may be at different stages. Now, actually, in many ways, it's great to have that complexity within a team because people are going to have different solutions that can be shared, provided. Now, this is the key thing. It doesn't matter where anyone is in the spiral. What's important is whether they're open, arrested, or closed. If people are open, see, some of the best chief executives are operating out of the blue code. But if they're open, they're aware of their limitations and are willing to surround themselves with people who have different ways, more complex ways of seeing and acting. If they're arrested, it's a little harder. If they're closed, it's almost impossible to work with someone who's closed.
And just to follow up the same thing, there's really not a right or wrong about being in any one of these stages. And it sort of brings out the importance of having all the different voices represented as much as we can. And I think all those different pieces are important for a comprehensive solution.
That's right. That's absolutely right. To wear the hat of red, so you can maintain your sense of green value, but to wear that red hat, because it's already in you in some way, and play out, match aggression for aggression.
In this culture, in a wedding room, according to where you are.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think this is a great way of exploring improvisation through this. Now, I want to move on. I would say these are some of the areas where you might think about how to connect with those stages of development. So, how might you lead or manage people at each level differently? How would you influence them differently? Because influencing someone at orange, materialism, rationality, achievement, and managing someone at, say, the blue code is very different. They want very different things. And of course, you've got people transitioning. I would say if you're currently feeling a sense of discomfort and uncertainty about what you're doing in the world, the chances are you may well be transitioning from one stage to another. Not necessarily upwards either. You go down the spiral as well as go up it. So all these areas give us a sense of what might we need to do with greater flexibility in order to connect. And the general idea is that these three things will help you connect with all different stages. A sense of politeness and openness and recognition of people, even if they're coming from a different space with different values. It's respectfulness, openness to where people are coming from. Now, this is stuff you already do in improvisation. It's not rocket science for you, but I think it is for many people in organizations. And accountability, being willing to take responsibility for oneself and one's actions, to stand up and be accountable. In the literature on spiral dynamics, that's called autocracy, but it pisses the hell out of green. Okay, I want to finish with an activity around. I'm going to miss that. Could you all make this grid on a piece of paper? What I'd like to finish off with is this. We've just looked at the spiral, and each stage we develop our own navigating values, and those navigating values may change as we transition from one stage of the spiral to the next stage. But our core values continue in spite of all those changes. Our core values go from childhood all the way through to the grave, to the grave. So I'd like to explore what core values there may be within us, because often they're not as clear as we might think they are or might like them to be. So if you've all done that grid, you can just put it away for a moment, and I'd like you to choose one of these themes and create a past story. So it could be a favorite place when you were younger, or how you overcame a challenge or an obstacle. An incident with someone who impressed you. Some significant event, or a key turning point in your life. See what emerges. Choose one. And this is going to be totally chaotic, but you're used to that kind of stuff. But as soon as you've got, and notice as you're going through this, you're probably going through that U curve we talked about. It's a very natural process, very intuitive. See what emerges. So when you've got the story, one of these, just put your hand up. Okay, wait a minute. The instructions. See, I'd like you in a moment to put your hand up when you're ready. Find someone else who's got their hand up. Stand up, because standing up energy, as you know, as we all know, is different from sitting down energy. So stand up, go find a place around, and tell each other your story. I'd really recommend you keep it to a maximum 2-minute story, because that's a discipline in itself. And most people in business don't have much more than 2 minutes of time to listen. So keep it short, tell your story, listen to your partner's story, then put your hand up again, find somebody else, and tell your story again. And then maybe tell your story 2 or 3 times to different people. Notice how it grows and develops. Notice how you want to edit it, and go with what comes up for you. And when you hear the sound of these distant bells, then that means you have about a minute to finish your story, and then come back and sit down, and then we'll talk about that. Is everybody clear? Okay? So, when you're ready, hands up, go and tell your stories. Have fun. that don't come back?
Can you send them there?
What'd you get from that?
Connection, deep connection.
Deep connection. Yeah, notice you really deep bonding. I was 3 or 4, and I think you did about 1.5.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it works differently for different people. That's fantastic.
Living water, it's the water.
It's the water, it's the gift.
It was the water.
Yeah, the gift of generosity. What about your stories? You told it. Did it grow? Did it change?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Power of reversal.
The other
editing.
person's response to my story gave me an insight into my own story.
Yeah. Did you hear that? The other person's insight into her story.
The other
His
person's
response gave you an insight into what it was about, deeper levels.
The drama was lessened. You know, so much of my story is drama. It was just lessened. It was like, well, this was significant. It really was, you know.
That's interesting because what I heard from it, those are just my, it's my stuff. But there is a thing about when one tells, it's a story about some pain. Often just the telling and articulating of that painful story released it. Yeah. Yeah. It helps us to own it. Helps us to own it. Yeah.
It became the beginning of a story that we're going to keep telling later. It was the prologue.
Absolutely.
To a shared story.
Yeah. And our lives are so full of so many stories, many of which we've lost track of. We've lost the connection in the depths inside us, in what Chomsky would have called deep structure. Stories are still, experiences are held as stories, are still inside us, we've just lost connection. And one of the beauties is that we tell each other stories, those connections start to get charged again. There was something in the playback session this morning where I think Drew told a story and somebody said, well, if it hadn't been for that story about kindergarten, I wouldn't have remembered that story, which I'd forgotten all about. And suddenly, it all starts to re-emerge. And in a sense, we're the product of all our stories. And yet our stories all hold us stuck where we think we are, our sense of identity, which is a very narrow perspective. Well, that's a different sentence, I suppose. But it's quite interesting. Okay, what I'd like you to do is, with your grid, could you give your story that you told a title, whatever you like, and put it in the middle column? Just give your story a title. Don't agonize too much. You can go back to it and change it later, but give it a title just for now. Okay, and these symbols simply mean present, past, future. So having given a title here, in this column, I'd like you to just think about your story and write down in the left-hand column all the key values that are present in that story for you. Why did you choose that story? What was important about it? And what values that you hold emerge from that? Some of you find quite a lot of values emerge from that, and some not so many. That's just one story. In all the stories that you hold inside of yourself currently, there will be more. see this grid as a resource bank of your own personal stories. You might, for example, look at one of the values you've written down and ask yourself, what stories do I know that bring out this value in me? How does the value I've written down trigger, resonate with other things in my life, other stories? And then you can start to put those titles here, so you can start to work between here and here to generate more and more stories that are about you. And I think one of the great things, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, is how telling personal stories opens up vulnerability in you, which allows others to enter into our reality, so they're more willing to become more vulnerable with you. Because only when we have that sense of vulnerability with each other, so I have a sense of who you really are, you have a sense of who I really am, and we begin to open up and dig below the surface level of communication down into the deeper structures where the interesting stuff really is, whether it's at a personal level or a professional level. Even at the professional level, people keep so much to themselves because of the lack of trust in others. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. One of the things about experts, who are experts in their field in organizations, one of the reasons it seems to me that they don't share as much as they could with their managers is that far too often the managers take the ideas from the experts and present it upwards to the board and don't give credit to the experts. The sense that lack of trust is holding so much information and possibility back. So you might start to think about ways to use this little grid here to explore more and more stories, more and more personal values, create a hierarchy of your own values if you want to do that. What really drives you? And here the question is, in the right-hand side, once you've identified which are your real, true core values, how are you in the present living and embodying those values in everything you do? And how could you do more of that into the future, into the right-hand column? You know, one of the things that I'm quite interested in at the moment is what I call midlife. Midlife is that time in one's life when you start to stop counting the days since you were born and start wondering how many to the exit strategy. Actually, it's a really liberating place to be because I suddenly realize that every moment is precious and every moment is a gift. And actually, I can begin to do what the hell I want, finally. And I think one of the problems is so many people in all kinds of work, let alone business, become a couple who came up with this term, but willing slaves. They give up their autonomy in return for a salary, security, safety, and being told what to do. And I think a really important question is if we can identify with what our values truly are, we can still be who we are and what we want to do, even while we work within organizations or anywhere else. But first of all, we've got to be clear about what our values are, what our core values are, and what. I want to bring this to a close. And what I might suggest is that maybe over lunch or later on, maybe if you feel like it, get together in small groups and just talk about for a few minutes how now you start to identify some of your values from the story you've just told, how you might start living that more in your life, and where specifically you could begin that process. I think it's one of the hardest things to really show up with what our real true values are. It takes courage, is where I started. It takes real courage to do that. Hoorah. Hoorah. I think for the last 2 weeks I've had my accent taken the piss out of in Salt Lake City. Just before I close, I deliberately haven't offered any solutions. I don't have any answers. And even if I did have answers, I think all the answers, all the solutions we come up with today just become tomorrow's problems. And I think systemic awareness allows us to see that. I mean, I'm not saying don't create ways of holding and working with the daily issues, but whatever we do out there in the consequences of systemic interrelationships will become another issue at some point in the future, which we need to be ready for. But some of the things I've found particularly useful or I've touched on is, if you want to know more about spiral dynamics, the big tome is quite big and academic is Don Beck and Chris Cowan's Spiral Dynamics, which I just touched on. A more cartoon-like way of getting into that is this book here, my book, More Magic of Metaphor, and there should be copies somewhere at the back for you to have a look at. If you're interested, you can sign up and publish a thing to write on if you want to get a copy. But in the More Magic of Metaphor book, what I've done is I've taken about 80 stories and looked at each story and how it resonates with the Ken Wilberforce quadrant model. So I said that, like the story of the traveler on the camel, that resonated with 4 quadrants, the archer in 3 quadrants. So each story has an analysis in terms of its quadrant connections, and also each story I've looked at it in terms of which of the stages of development it relates to. So that's quite an interesting way of getting to know it. I wrote it because I really like that because I wanted people who may not come across spiral to have a sense of what it is, because I found it so useful. Chen Kim's Blue Ocean Strategy is a nice book of cases about organizations that created a difference. For example, one of the cases he gives is I'm going to get my French problems again. La Liberté, who created Cirque du Soleil, and how he had a blue ocean moment of recognizing what had to be done to change traditional circuses from something that wasn't really very successful anymore, where people didn't want to see live animals in cages or this or that, and how to create some amazing spectacle which kept the tradition of the circus in a different way. There's a whole lot of cases which I think are very illuminating if you want to take the work into business. Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, again, some very clear writing and some great case histories about organizations that for 15 years were average on the Fortune 500 and then had 15 years of year-on-year growth. There were 11 only that fulfilled the criteria, and it's interesting to see what those companies were, because some of them are no longer up at the top. So the thing about leadership we identified was all the great leaders in those 11 companies, there were only 11 companies, had a combination of fierce professional will and amazing personal humility. So the chances are that the 11 leaders of those great companies at that time, no one's ever heard of. Because the key thing was their attitude was, how can I be a steward? How can I leave this company in better shape for succession that it was when I took over? You know, and when you get a lot of people kind of the red or orange zone in an organization, you don't get that. These are books you can look at of mine. This last one's just come out, The Sound of Knowledge. The Sound of Knowledge is an old Irish story. And I won't tell you what the story is, but basically this old Irish story, 700 years, makes it very clear that if we want to be a mature, fully functioning human being, what we have to do is integrate the rational side of ourselves with the intuitive side. And unless we can do that, we are in denial of half of who we are. And I think that's a great message for all of us, and particularly for organizations. Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Elements of Maintenance and Liner. You either hate them or love them. Loves them some more and more, but I think his exploration of what is quality and what is valued, what are values, is fabulous. Peter Senge, his work on presence and also the 5th disciplinal systems, I would recommend those. Sun Tzu, Art of War, familiar with that? Sun Tzu, Chinese general, maybe could be a compilation of other people's writings, but maybe living 3,000 years ago, time of the 3 kingdoms. His view was that the way to be a great general was never to fight a battle. unless you had it. So how to build alliances, how to build diplomacy. And this book is still being used in all the military schools, but also in sport, in business organizations. Fabulous book, very, very thin as well. Finally, I particularly like the Hartsfield Bill Talbot work on stage development. And if you want to know more about that 7 stages of development in Harvard Business Review for April 2005, it's a good introduction. You can probably find it on the net as well. And Ken Wilber, I mentioned, theory of everything. Just let me listen. I just have to finish with a little story about values, because I know it's gone last time. There was a stranger who moved into a town where strangers weren't very much appreciated. And it wasn't long before all the kids in the community came around and started chucking stones and bricks and bottles into the lawn and at the windows of the stranger's house. And after a few days, the stranger surprised them by coming out onto his porch and saying, hey, that's pretty good what you're doing, and I'm quite impressed, but where I come from, I have to say that kids know how to insult and criticize and be nasty far better than what you're currently doing. And I tell you what, if you can come back tomorrow with some really choice insults, I'll give you each $1. Hey, they went off and they asked all their sisters and brothers some choice insults. And they came back the next day and they repeated the performance. And the stranger came out and listened. He said, well, that's pretty good. It's pretty good. Here's $1 each. They all got $1. They felt good about that. He said, that's pretty good, but it's still not up to the standard I'm used to in my own country. So come back tomorrow and do better, and I'll give you another 50 cents. So we went away and talked to their mothers and fathers and came back next day with a whole lot of really, really great insults. They hurled abuse at him for half an hour or so. He said, fantastic, excellent, much, much better. Here's 50 cents each. But it's still not as good as it is in the country I come from. So I tell you what, if you can do better than that, come back tomorrow and I'll give you another 10 cents. And the kids went, 10 cents? 10 cents? What do you think we are? We're not doing that for 10 cents. So they went away and never came back. It just wasn't worth it. Thank you very much.
I wanted to say 2 things. One is, I knew it. Thank you so much, Nick, for your keynote. And let's go to lunch. Thank you all very much.
Tickets!
That I'm involved with right now are literally